Ladles and jelly spoons, welcome back to Badgerworks. Today, this is a piece of glass, as you can see. It's a piece that I acquired a little while ago. They're designed for fireplaces. It's basically a chunk of broken coloured glass, and the idea is you put them in fireplaces and you light them from underneath and they look like glowing coals. Anyway, that's not really the point. In a recent video I made a glowstone diorama, and I was contacted by several people afterwards asking how I'd made the stone, how I cast it. I mentioned in that video that I had recast it from a glass crystal that my daughter had acquired. So I thought today I would show you how I made that mould and subsequently cast the stone. So I'm going to do that with this. So let's get on with it. Right, so we need something to make our mould in. So I've got here a plastic half-pint cup. I bought a load of these from the pound shop. And what we're going to do is put this in the bottom of here, like so. It's a fairly snug fit, but there's enough room for the rubber to get all the way around successfully. So this is what we'll use to stick this in, because obviously when we make the mould we need to have a way when we're finished to get whatever we're going to cast with, whatever resin we're going to use, we need to get it in there. We also need to lift the piece off the bottom of the cup so that the rubber can get underneath it. So what we're going to do that, we can kill two birds with one stone. If we take this, and we can take a bit of this white tack, again from the pound shop. So if we just take a piece of this and just basically work it a bit, it's a bit cold so it's gone kind of hard. Basically work it into a ball and then stick it on the underside like that. Like so. And now what this will do is it will allow us to stick the glass to the bottom of the cup, and it will also give us a hole in the finished mould for us to pour the resin into. Now we can take this, put it in the bottom, make sure it's roughly in the middle, and just push it down. And there we go. And see, now that's nicely stuck in there. There's a nice gap all the way around, and more importantly there's a gap at the bottom. It's going to fall off when I tip it up because it's heavy. There's a gap at the bottom for the rubber to get underneath it. So now we can think about mixing our rubber. So this is the rubber that I'm going to use. I buy all of my casting supplies from a company called DWR Plastics. This is prosthetic skin rubber, and the reason I use this is because it's very, very soft. You can see here it says Shore A5. Rubber has a Shore rating that determines how hard it is, and the lower the number, the softer the rubber. This stuff is incredibly soft, and as a result it's great for making small moulds of relatively complex shapes. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix some of this up in a minute, and we're going to cast our stone. So this rubber mixes 1-to-1 by weight. It comes in a part A and a part B, and you mix them equally by weight. So we need to figure out roughly how much rubber we need, because we don't want to obviously mix too much. Now I've got another cup here, the same size as the one that's got the stone in. Now ideally we want the mould to come up to about here. So you could say, oh, we'll just do half of one and half of the other. But you have to take into account the volume of the stone inside there, so that's going to push it on more. So we probably need about half of this. So we'll mix half plus a little bit extra for safety. So basically, we put our cup on our scale, turn it on, and it will zero itself. Now we take our part A rubber and pour it in the cup. And as I said, we'll go about a quarter of the way up the cup, just over a quarter. So I think if we go for 100 grams, like that, and now we can pour in 100 grams of the part B. There we go. Now we can put the scales to one side and we can mix the rubber. Now when you're mixing this, mix it slowly and carefully. Ideally you want to mix in like a figure-8 pattern. Make sure you scrape around the sides of the pot, scrape across the bottom of the pot, because what you want to do is get this thoroughly mixed, because if you don't mix it thoroughly, it won't cure. You will also notice that I'm not wearing gloves. The reason I'm not wearing gloves is because silicone rubber is very sensitive to all kinds of things that will stop it from curing. You only have to look at this stuff funny and it won't cure. So we just keep mixing and mixing and mixing. If you're wearing rubber gloves, the rubber, the vinyl in the gloves can actually stop the rubber from curing. Once it's cured, the stuff's bomb-proof, but until it's cured, it's very sensitive to everything and anything. So I'm going to mix this for about 5 minutes. It's got a pot life of between 10 and 20 minutes. So I can easily mix this for 5 minutes with no problems at all. And that's just to make sure that it's completely mixed. Now one of the nice things about this particular kind of rubber, because it is thin, comparatively speaking, you don't often need to degas it. Degassing is a process when you're mixing rubber. You put the mixed rubber in a vacuum chamber and it basically sucks any air bubbles out of the mixture, so you don't get air bubbles in your mould. The nice thing about this stuff, and it's one of the reasons I use this, is because it is quite thin and therefore is not so prone to getting bubbles in it. So as long as you mix it slowly and carefully, you won't get bubbles in it. Okay, I think that will do us. So now we get our cup with our stone in and we pour in the rubber. Now don't pour the rubber straight over the top of what you're moulding. Pour it down the side and let it rise up around it as much as possible. I mean, obviously it's a tricky thing to do. And again, pour it slowly in a nice thin stream like this. And then that way, if there are any air bubbles in it, they'll actually pop before they get to the mould. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second. And now, very carefully, I'm just going to hold that in place and I'm just going to tip it on its side slightly. And the reason I'm doing that is so that if there's any air bubbles trapped underneath it, they can come out. Just, that's it, that's all you need to do. And now we can continue pouring the rubber. And there's the rubber poured. Now we can leave it to cure, and once that's done we can demold it and see what we've come up with. So while we're waiting for that to dry, I wanted to talk about this stuff because this is another alternative. This is Bluestuff. You may be familiar with green stuff, which is a two-part epoxy putty, modelling putty. This is made by the same people. It's called Bluestuff. This is basically a thermoset plastic. So if I just take it out of the box, put that to one side. Now, it's, as you can see, it's kind of flexible, but fairly rigid. No laughing at the back there. But basically what this stuff does, it's very clever. It's for making small, like one-shot moulds. So what you do, and I'll show you how it works. So what I've got in this tub is some, it's just warm water from the tap. And you basically pop this stuff in, however much of it you need, and you let it warm up. Let the water warm it up. Now while that's warming up, this is what I'm going to make a mould of. This is a little ammo box, or well, a crate, a wooden crate. I made one of these a long time. It was basically just scratch built out of some styrene, various bits of styrene stuck together to make a little ammo box. And this is one that I've made a silicone mould of this, and I've cast loads of these for myself. But I'm going to use this stuff to make another mould of it so you can see how it works. Right, and as you can see, this has now gone quite gloopy. You've got to be careful because obviously it's hot water. Don't burn your fingers on it, so just go easy. But you see it's gone very soft. You see it's turned into this, like a soft putty. Let's get about half of this. Make sure that's nicely pressed all the way around, and then leave it to cool down. Right, so these have cooled down pretty much all the way now. I also did a little skull that I found. So now we can take our pieces out. So that's the little skull that I did. I don't know how well you can actually see that, but we'll pour some resin in it in a minute and see how it works. And then obviously we've got our tub, our box. I'll do the same for that, just drag it out. So now we can basically fill that with resin and then let it cure. So this is the resin I'm going to use for these moulds. This is a polyester fast cast 2-part epoxy. You mix it, again, part A and part B, 1:1 by weight, not by volume. I have to say this resin is quite old and I'm not entirely sure if it's going to cure or not. It's way outside of its shelf life. But we'll give it a go and we'll see what happens. It'll either cure or it won't. The pot life on this is about 7 minutes, so I'm going to give it a good stir. The nice thing about this stuff is it's like water, so it goes into, you know, for sort of complicated moulds it's brilliant, because it will settle into all the corners and all the little nooks and crannies without any problems at all. One of the things you have to be careful of with this fast cast resin is it produces quite a lot of heat. The exothermic reaction is quite strong, so you do have to be careful with it. I'm not entirely sure how well it's going to work with this Bluestuff. I'm hoping it won't get so hot that it actually deforms the mould. Now we can just leave that to cure. One thing I will say, because obviously there's quite a lot of plastic left over, whenever you're pouring moulds, always have some spare moulds laying around, so that if you need to, you can, rather than wasting this resin, you can pour it into another mould and just cast anything. I always have a selection of small moulds kicking around that I can just chuck any, you know, leftover plastic into, just so it doesn't get wasted. Okay, these have had plenty of time to cure, so we should be able to demould them now. So they should just pop out. So there's our skull. That's come out quite nicely. And this one will probably be a little bit tricky to get out, but it should be okay. There we go. Yeah, not bad at all. Obviously we need to clean up the bottom of it and everything to make it sit flat, but apart from that it's absolutely fine. So yeah, this stuff works for quick, simple moulds like this. I mean, obviously we could now put more resin and use this again if we wanted to. Yeah, it's just another way of making a small mould quickly and relatively cheaply. So anyway, let's get on with our main mould and see how we're getting on with that. So here's our mould, still in the tub. The easiest way to get this out of this is to just pull. Just be careful when you're doing this, because sometimes you get sharp edges. There we go. Recycle that, don't throw it in the bin. Okay, so now we need to get the master out of the mould. Now, again, because this is very soft rubber, it should be fairly easy to get this out. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you can't get the master out, what you can do is use a razor blade and cut a slot about halfway down the side, and that will let you open up the top of the mould. Obviously then you have to be slightly careful when you pour in the mould. You need to put something around it to hold it together. But the nice thing about this nice soft rubber is I should be able to get this out without too much trouble. Now, to start with, it will be tricky because there'll be quite a lot of vacuum pressure in there trying to hold everything in. And what I also need to be careful of, because this is glass, obviously it has some sharp edges, so I need to be careful not to cut the mould. So let's get rid of that first of all. Right, here we go, wish me luck. That's it, it's coming out. And there we go. And now we have a nice one-piece mould. So what we can do now is fill this with resin and cast something. So I've got another plastic cup here, a slightly smaller one this time, to pour the resin into. And again, we need to figure out roughly how much we need. So you could measure the volume of the object, it's not difficult, but for the sake of expediency, if I put this in here, you can see that with all the space around it, if we fill it up to about here, that should give us enough. Now, the resin that I'm using is a water clear polyester resin. So let me pour some into the cup and we'll talk a bit more about the resin. This is the resin that I'm using. It's a 5 kilo bottle, a gallon bottle, so it's quite hefty. But that's what I'm using. It's a water clear casting resin. It is designed for deep pours, but it does still produce an exothermic reaction, so you do need to be careful. So I'm going to add the hardener now, which is in this bottle here. You have to be fairly careful with hardener. The worst thing you can do is put too much in. If you put too much in, you'll get a massive exothermic reaction. It will get very hot, it will dry, it will crack, it will cure, if it cures at all, it will cure really cloudy and horrible. So you really don't want to put too much in. They normally say between 1 and 3% by volume. So what I normally do is, like with a cup this size, I'll put maybe 10 drops of hardener in. If you put less hardener in, it will just take longer to cure, but it will still cure. So I'll put 10 drops in, roughly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now when I start to mix this, you'll see it will go kind of cloudy. And that's fine, don't worry about it. Just keep mixing it until it goes clear again, and then mix it more. Again, don't mix it too fast, you don't want to get air bubbles in it. One thing you can do with resin is if you put like this cup in a bath of warm water to warm the resin up, it will cure much faster, so be wary of that. You'll greatly reduce the pot life, but it will also mix a lot easier, and it will thin out and pour a lot easier. So I'll just give this a good mix, but nice and slowly. Again, scrape the sides, scrape the bottom. If you don't, what will happen is you'll end up with pockets of resin that don't have any hardener, and they will never ever cure. So we'll just give this a good mix for about 5 or 10 minutes. Now you can see this does have some bubbles in it. This resin's actually quite cold. It's probably a bit too cold, really. But for the purposes of what we're doing, it won't really matter. If there are some air bubbles in this, I'm not overly concerned. As I say, you could vacuum degas this. I'm not going to. I actually find in some cases having a few little bubbles floating around inside it actually help. They actually can add to the look of, depending on what you're doing. Right, that's gone clear again. So we'll just keep stirring it for another couple of minutes and then we'll pour it in. Right, okay, I've been stirring this for about 5 minutes now, so that should be enough. So now we take our mould and we pour now. What I'm going to do, same as I did before, just set that to one side for a second, and I'm going to just turn the mould. Now you have to be careful not to tip it out, but I'm going to turn the mould and I'm going to let the resin come right up to the top, to the edge, because I want to get a nice coat of resin on the underside of this top, and that will help reduce any possibility of air bubbles once we fill the mould up to the top. So by rotating like this, it's called slush casting, and it just coats the inside of the mould and gives you less possibility of air bubbles and things like that in the mould when you fill it right up. Okay, now we can fill the mould all the way up. Now I'm just going to give the mould a little bit of just tip it on its side slightly. Because I don't know if you can actually see in there, but there's an air bubble there, and there's an air bubble there, and there's some air bubbles up there. For this, I'm not particularly bothered. What you can do with these kind of moulds is, if you find you have problems with air bubbles, is you can actually poke a hole in the mould through the top at various strategic points to let that air come out. For what we're doing here, I'm not that bothered. So we'll just let this work around a little bit. See, we can just give the mould a stretch and things like that to try and get the worst of the air bubbles out. What you can also do is take your stirring stick and poke it in there and work the bubbles out, you see. Once you kind of get the bubbles moving, they'll quite often want to come out to the top on their own. So this is another thing about this rubber, is it's nice and translucent, so you can see what you're doing. I mean, you can clearly see the stick, so it makes it easier to see any errant air bubbles. Get rid of that one. Right, I think that's got the worst of the bubbles out anyway. Okay, now we just wait for this to cure. Right, so here's our mould. I've left it overnight to cure, and it has done. So now we can take the cast piece out of the mould. Just talk amongst yourselves for a minute. Right, and there we go. Yeah, that's not too bad at all, actually. One thing you might find, and you can see it's just happened here, with some of these polyester resins, even when they're fully cured, you can get fingerprints on them. One thing you can do to fix that, if it happens, is put the mould into a warm oven. And when I mean warm, I mean like about 60 degrees for about 15-20 minutes. And that will harden the thing completely. Either that, or you can just leave it for a few days and it will completely cure. But yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. So there's our original. So there's our original and our copy. One thing with resins, especially polyester resins, they do shrink slightly, and some shrink more than others. This resin I think shrinks, they estimate between 3 and 6%. So you will notice that this is actually very slightly smaller than the original, but I mean it's barely noticeable. So yeah, quite pleased with that. Now, before I finish, one of the things I wanted to talk about is the subject of your castings. You'll notice here I've done a piece of glass, and I did the little packing crate that was something I made myself. Don't recast stuff other people have made, especially things like resin kits and stuff like that. There's a huge market for basically pirated stuff out there, and people do it a lot, and it really annoys me. They'll basically buy something from someone else, make their own moulds, cast inferior copies and then sell them. Don't do that. The purpose of this kind of casting is to reproduce items for your own use, you know, not to make a profit off someone else's work. Yeah, don't cast other people's stuff, basically. It's not clever. It's basically theft. It's just, sorry, it's I'm ranting now, and it annoys me. You know, if you're making something, I'm going to give you an example. This here, I don't know whether you can see this. This is a nut, a domed nut that I made. And I was doing a project a couple of years ago, and I needed a whole bunch of these. And I had some made of brass, but if I'd have put all the brass ones on, it would have weighed a ton. So I recast them in plastic to make it lighter. So, you know, stuff like that, yeah, great. But don't be taking other people's stuff and, you know, selling it, because that's really not on at all. And it's the same thing with like parts for kits. I know a lot of people who asked about this video were on about casting parts for models and stuff like that, and if you're doing it for your own use, you know, that's one thing, but don't be casting kits to sell on, because that's just not on. Anyway, enough of that. Getting back to our subjects here, you can see that as I said before, it's a pretty much, I mean, it is basically an exact copy. So what you can do with this now is anything you like. You can, you know, use it as a diorama, as I've done already, or, you know, whatever takes your fancy. Obviously you could cast this in other types of plastic. I mean, I used a polyester resin here basically because it's cheap. You can get clear polyurethane 2-part resins, which are really nice. The trouble is with those is they tend to be quite expensive, comparatively speaking, and for things like this, polyester will work fine. Obviously you can colour this as well. You can buy dyes and things like that to colour the resin. You can make 2-part moulds if you want more complex shapes. Yeah, you can do anything you like. Once you've mastered the art of casting, you can pretty much do what you want. So yeah. Anyway, I hope this video has been of interest to you. If you've got any questions, which I'm sure there will be, please feel free to ask in the comments or on my Facebook page. And if this is the kind of thing that's, you know, interesting to you, we can look at more in-depth casting in the future. You know, using vacuum chambers and pressure casting and 2-part moulds and all that kind of thing. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers, bye.